So we're going to talk about the final aspect of Italian Renaissance entertainment. So we talk about the private entertainment for the courts and the academic elite, and now we're going to talk about the stuff that everyday people were seeing, commedia dell'arte. So when we talk about commedia, we're talking about groups of traveling players, literally, right, a band of 10, 12, 15 people who have probably a wagon and move from town to town, set up shop in town square, and do improv performances. And if they're lucky, right, so they're primarily doing little improv comedy performances on the street. If they're lucky, a noble will see them perform and will invite them to give a court performance. So there's a possibility of making even more money. But the big idea here is that the traveling players, the commedia troops, make their money by passing the hat. So they're interested primarily in pleasing and entertaining the audience. And so they are working with stock characters because they need easily recognizable character types. They have only a short amount of time to tell a story, and they don't know the audience very well, and the audience doesn't know them, so they've got to present recognizable, easily understandable characters and stories. And in support of that, we get really significantly sort of specified stock character types. And those stock characters are defined by their masks. So again, if I'm walking down the streets of Pisa and I see a commedia troupe setting up shop to do a performance, I'm not going to be too hard pressed to understand what their performance is about because I have these stock character types and the masks to give me an idea right off the bat of what kind of story we're dealing with. And they are structured around pre-existing stories, but they're always improvised. So, and there are commedia tragedies as well. By and large, when we think of commedia, we think of comedy, and that's kind of how I'm going to focus in this conversation. But there are occasional tragic performances in commedia. The improvisation is key because the reason we improvise as a commedia troupe is because we want to take a story that we've got and tailor it to the specific social fabric of the town we're in. And commedia troupes will even frequently send a guy ahead to the next town and ask around and have a drink with some people and sort of get the town gossip so that those elements and references and little in-jokes can be used in the improvised performance. So again, it's a very audience-pleasing performance. Compare this to the academic and court theater, which is intended to visually impress the audience, but not through telling a good story. So here we're trying to impress and entertain the audience through telling a fun, entertaining, accessible story. And there are two parts of the commedia performance structure. There are scenarios, and in the scenario, it's basically a point-by-point plot summary of what's going to happen in a given scene. And so the scenarios are sort of strung together, create a larger story. But then in between each scenario is a lazzi. And a lazzi is this sort of inter-scenario entertainment where we just bring a couple guys on and do something funny that maybe doesn't relate to anything at all that was going on. And I'll show you some examples in a minute of scenarios and lazzi. But first, let's take a look at some of the examples of the kind of masks and the kind of stock characters that are used constantly in commedia. These are really common types. We've got Brighella, who is the first Zanni. Zanni are the whole servant class of characters. And the first Zanni is always that clever servant. So if you think of the servant in Tartuffe, for example, or if we go all the way back to Brothers, Sirius, that clever servant character, it really establishes the character type of the servant who might even be smarter than the master and who is sort of manipulating and pulling the strings of the given plot. That's a Brighella type character. Here we have Arlecchino. He's a clown or a court jester, and that's really the sort of chaotic character, the one who brings unexpected chaos and craziness to whatever scene is going on. Plays heavily for physical comedy. So if you take a look at that wooden thing he's holding, that is actually a wooden stick that has a slight space in between the two halves of it. So when you hit somebody, the two halves smack together and make a loud smacking noise or a slapping noise. And that is literally, that's a slapstick. That's where the word comes from. It's a stick with which you slap people. So Arlecchino wields that stick. He's almost kind of like a Bugs Bunny character, is the closest analogy that comes to mind. Pantalone is a greedy old man and grumpy but also is frequently like leering at the younger women and trying to sleep with them, and basically represents this sort of old establishment, this corrupt old establishment character. Dottore is that basically the guy who thinks he knows everything but is actually a bumbling fool. He's pompous and arrogant, but he's actually really stupid, and he frequently fits the role of doctor or lawyer. And I would add in that we can see these kind of character types all throughout even contemporary storytelling. And so, as we go through these, I would love for you to think about places we see the Dottore, places we see Pantalone in modern pop culture storytelling. The Capitano. This is a guy who talks a good game, but when it comes down to it, is ultimately a coward. He's got all the gear of a soldier, but he doesn't know how to use it. He has all the braggadocio and the talk, but he ends up being a coward when it really matters. The Cowardly Lion from Wizard of Oz is a good example of this, although, of course, in the Wizard of Oz, he does find his courage, but he's really a sort of a model for the captain or capitano. And then every commedia troupe has the lovers. The lovers don't wear masks. The lovers are the ones who kind of drive the plot. There's always some love story or love interest, and they're always the pretty people. So even in ancient commedia, in Renaissance commedia storytelling, we got to have pretty people and we have to have a love story. That's sort of a recurring factor. And we will see the lovers all throughout theater history, obviously. And these are the romantic comedy lead characters, whereas all of our other ones are sort of supporting role type characters. If you sort of page back through those, and there are a lot of supporting characters, and then the lovers tend to be sort of our main characters. They're not actually very interesting. They're just pretty to look at. So here I talked about scenario and Lazzi. So here's a scenario entitled A Play Within a Play. And by the way, I would like to add one of the reasons we don't read Commedia is because it's so improvised. Nonetheless, there are still leftover books of scenarios. So you can imagine the basic scenario that's going to result from the dialogue I'm about to give you here. So I'm going to bring up the dialogue. Pantalone and Zanni Pantalone says he wants to give his daughter Lydia in marriage. I'm good to go. I'm going to give away my daughter. Coviello, another character, has asked for her hand, and he would like to accept. So we've got this basically the setup of a dad is going to give away his daughter, and there's a suitor, and we've got the deal set up, and we're all good to go. Coviello enters from the house. He overhears that Pantalone, the father, is going to give him away. Then there's a Lazzi, so we just kind of throw that in there. We'll come back to what a Lazzi is in a minute. Then he and the father come to an agreement on the dowry. Coviello calls Lydia, dad calls daughter from the house, and she is told she will be given in marriage. She initially refuses. There's another Lazzi. Finally, she gives way and touches Coviello's hand. So this scenario that you can see here, if we stretch this out and improvise different parts of it, this could easily take 20 minutes, right? Or more, because what we're doing is improvising the text and stretching out the debate, and they come to an agreement on the dowry. That sentence alone in performance could take 15 minutes about what money will come along with Lydia, etc. So this is one example of the way in which a commedia troupe is going to have a sort of skeleton of a story, but each time they perform it for each different town, it's going to be slightly different based on audience response, based on the in-jokes they might add in relevant to that particular town, stuff like that. So in between, where those Lazzi are, here are some examples of Lazzi. The Lazzo of the Apples. Lazzi is plural, Lazzo is singular. Lazzo of the Apples. Harlequin and Pantalone tame a bear by throwing him apples, which he catches perfectly in his mouth. As you can see, that has nothing to do with this play within a play scenario at all. It's just a little sort of intermezzi entertainment where we're all right, let's pause the action and do something completely different. Lazzo of Vomit. At the beginning of a performance or just after drinking some of the doctor's medicine, Harlequin vomits. Again, nothing to do with anything else in the scene. Lazzo of the Rising Dagger, and here we have some mild obscenity. After hearing about the physical perfections of a certain woman, Pantalone's dagger begins to rise between his legs. So you can see why this kind of comedic storytelling lasted, why it influenced theatrical writing all throughout the Renaissance. I mean, in Spain, in France, there are elements of Shakespeare that can be clearly seen as being influenced by Commedia, and even today, numerous comic types. So Commedia, although we don't have any entire written works of Commedia, its influences are much, much more significant than are the influences of the visual and academic theater of the rich people and the educated. And that concludes our conversation about the Italian Renaissance.